In the small town of Black Hollow, Virginia, December air bit sharp through the pines, and the sky threatened snow. The church loomed on its hill, lantern lights spilling pale and uncertain from high, arched windows. Inside, its wooden pews creaked under the weight of expectation. They were packed as usual on a Sunday. Farmhands with rough, hatless heads bowed, merchants and mothers clutching fraying gloves, and children held in the vice grip of silence. It was not the Lord's promise that filled the room, but the pull of a man who seemed to know them all, the preacher, Jonathan Reed. He had charisma, the kind that draws the gaze of every eye, a grin disarmingly wide, voice gentle and melodic. Villagers whispered about him in markets and on porches, how he'd arrived 5 years earlier from the north, how he'd rebuilt their rotting chapel with his own hands, and that when he called for alms, bread and coins always overflowed the poor box. No one could ignore how his presence quieted quarreling neighbors and soothed families feuding over border fences. He was their moral pillar, a kindly shepherd, if you believed the sunlit version. That evening, Reed's sermon was about forgiveness. His hands moved with poetic grace as he spoke, palms open, his gaze traveling through the crowd as if he sought some lost soul in the sea of faces. He told of shame, of secrets whispered in dark barns and confessions stifled for decades. Mothers dabbed their eyes, and even old men, chins bristling with gray, glanced away. He ended with a prayer, voice so tender that a hush seemed to hang in the rafters long after the final amen. As the congregation filed out, Reed stood in the narthex, each smile landing with practiced warmth. He grasped hands, a farm boy with clay under his nails, a widow trembling in her shawl, and offered assurances. "You're seen," he told them, "and you are forgiven." If anyone noticed the glint of something colder in his blue eyes, they buried it under gratitude and relief. Once the last soul left for the cold, Reed locked the great door, its cast-iron bolt scraping into place. Alone in the grand emptiness, he allowed the gentle curve of his lips to flatten. He strode quietly down the aisle, stopping at the altar. His fingers traced the smooth grain of the table, the gesture tender as a caress, yet oddly possessive. He knelt and prayed, voice low, the words indistinct but urgent. The truth was that Jonathan Reed kept his confessions for the dark. In his modest parsonage beside the graveyard, he kept a leather-bound journal locked in the bottom drawer of his desk. Its pages chronicled more than prayers and schedules. It was a ledger of failures, weaknesses, his and those told to him under oath. The entries were detailed, analytic, almost clinical. That night, Reed dined alone by lamplight. His study, lined with sermons and dusty volumes, was cold but meticulously tidy. He cut a slice of bread, fixed himself a modest plate, and read from a thin envelope he'd received earlier that week. The note was unsigned, written in a nervous, angular hand. "Preacher, there are things you've done that can't stay hidden forever. Some sins cannot be washed away. I am watching you." Reed placed the letter aside, face unreadable. He sat for a long time in silence, listening to the ticking of his clock and the wind scraping the shutters. His hand drifted to the journal again, fingers tracing old entries, fights settled and debts forgiven, but also darker thoughts, impulses pressed into the margins in his tight, careful script. Midnight approached. From his window, Reed watched the shadows of the trees sway under the moonlight. He left the lamp burning and slipped on his heavy coat, glancing at the house across the field, a small, weather-worn home, its roof patched with tin. There, the Watkins family lived, a father crippled by a mill accident, a mother stretched thin with illness, and a son, Elijah, whom Reed had taken an interest in for reasons known only to himself. He crossed the yard, boot heels muffled on the frostbitten grass. Smoke curled from the Watkins chimney. A single candle glowed in a back window. At the door, Reed barely knocked before Mrs. Watkins greeted him, her face pinched with worry. Her eyes searched his face, hopeful and desperate. He nodded gently, stepping into their cramped parlor. The air was thick with sickness and the sharp smell of lye soap. He offered words of comfort, hands folded in practiced empathy. He insisted on leading a prayer for Elijah, who sat pale and feverish by the hearth. As Reed placed a cool hand on Elijah's brow, he whispered words that only the child could hear. Elijah's eyes widened, fear flickering in their depths. Reed finished the prayer and assured Mrs. Watkins that he would bring food and medicine in the morning. Leaving the Watkins home, the smile never left Jonathan Reed's face. Yet in the narrow lane under the failing moon, he paused, letting the mask drop at last. The calm, velvet voice became something harder, almost hungry. Tonight, another letter awaited him back at the parsonage. Another anonymous accusation. Reed's mind worked, weighing possibilities with clinical detachment. If his secrets unraveled, he knew, the whole town would fall into chaos. He could not allow that. Not when he had come so far, become so adored. The cold night pressed against him as he returned to his darkened rooms. Above, the bell tower ticked away another hour, ominous and slow. He believed himself a man of God. But what he did in the shadows was something else entirely. Tomorrow would bring confession and absolution, as it always did. But tonight, Black Hollow's preacher tightened the shutters against prying eyes. The storm gathering in his heart was only beginning. Morning broke quietly over Black Hollow. The frost had hardened into thin glass across the fields, and the hills swept pale beneath a sky streaked with smoke-colored clouds. The bell at St. Matthew's Church rang with calm authority, summoning the faithful once again. To the villagers, it was the sound of constancy, of divine rhythm. But for Jonathan Reed, it was a reminder of control, how easily the people's hearts could be tuned like instruments when played by the right hand. At sunrise, Reed walked the narrow lane toward the church with his Bible pressed against his chest. His breath clouded in the crisp air. Every step echoed in the hollow hush of morning. The Watkins boys' fever had worsened overnight, a fact that weighed on the whispers already curling through the town like smoke from damp wood. The preacher prayed with him, they said with equal awe and suspicion. And now Elijah burns with fever still. But Reed did not flinch. Instead, he greeted each uneasy glance with that steady, disarming smile. By mid-morning, he was at his desk, rereading the anonymous letters that had arrived in recent weeks. Each one was slightly different. Shifts in penmanship, phrases changed, but all echoed the same accusation. Someone had seen him those nights he vanished from his house. Someone knew he was not alone in the church after the lamps went out. At first, he had dismissed them as the work of envy or madness. But now their timing felt pointed, deliberate. They referenced people he had counseled privately, secrets that should have remained sealed by oath and reverence. Reed poured himself a cup of black coffee and watched the liquid swirl. His reflection on its surface looked distorted. Mouth wider, eyes darker. The words in his head came back like a litany. I am watching you. He could not afford a scandal. Not now, not when the town's faith in him was the very foundation of his reign. So he planned. He always planned. He would find the author, and he would stop them. That afternoon, Samuel Owens, the town's deputy, knocked at his door. A broad man with a slow gait and a quicker mind than folks gave him credit for. Owens removed his hat, letting his voice fill the narrow hall. Morning, Reverend. Folk been talking. That boy Elijah, he's turning worse. And the Watkinses say you were with him late. Any chance the child said something you think I ought to know? Reed stood perfectly still, just long enough for the question to sharpen between them. Then he smiled. Only that he feared losing his soul before the Lord could take it, Samuel. The poor child doesn't need gossip piled on his suffering. Owens frowned, fingers tightening on the brim of his hat. Maybe so. Still, if someone's spreading lies, I intend to know who. The town gets uneasy easy these days. His eyes searched Reed's face, finding nothing but polite calm. You know how it is. Folk love a good story. That they do, Reed replied softly. But not all stories end with salvation. When Owens left, Reed closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling at last. The mask was heavier each day. That evening, when the church emptied after another prayer vigil for the boys' recovery, Reed stayed behind again. He extinguished each candle slowly, savoring the hush that followed. And then footsteps. Faint, hesitant, somewhere between curiosity and fear. He turned sharply. In the shadows near the confessional stood Clara Monroe, the schoolteacher. A plain young woman with quiet eyes and a reputation for patience. She clasped her hands tightly, the lamplight catching the sheen of perspiration at her temple. "Reverend," her voice broke, "I shouldn't be here this late, but I need to speak to you." Reed stepped closer, his tone wrapped in warmth. "Of course, child. You are always safe in God's house." She hesitated before handing him a folded paper. He opened it, heart pausing. Another anonymous note, but this one stained faintly at the edges, as if carried in a nervous hand too long. His gaze lifted back to hers. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "It was slipped under the school door this morning," she said. "I thought maybe you should know. It mentions you by name." Reed read the message. The handwriting differed again, but the tone was unmistakable. "You can cleanse your hands and pray your prayers, but the earth remembers. The graves do not forget." His mind raced, but outwardly he maintained composure. He touched Clara's shoulder gently. "You did the right thing bringing this to me. The devil works through fear and deception. You must not let him in." She nodded, but her eyes flicked toward the window, where the woods loomed dark beyond the glass. "Do you think someone's out there, Reverend? Watching us?" He allowed a brief, knowing smile. "Someone always is." That night, the preacher wandered the outskirts of town, lantern in hand. The church bell marked 9, then 10. Wind sifted through the pines like whispers. He reached the edge of the woods, where families seldom lingered after dusk. The earth here dipped low, marshy soil softening underfoot. He walked until he stood before a half-collapsed shed, the old caretaker's hut, abandoned years ago after the last caretaker vanished one winter without a trace. Inside, it smelled of rot and iron. Reed lifted his lantern and saw what he expected. Forgotten tools, broken glass, a shovel half buried in dust. He knelt and ran a gloved hand across the floorboards. They gave slightly under pressure. Hollow. From his coat, he removed a small iron key and unlocked a trapdoor cunningly fitted between the warped planks. Beneath lay darkness, cool and stagnant. He lowered his lantern and descended. The air changed here, thicker, close, filled with damp earth and something older. He reached the bottom, where the light revealed the edge of a stone cellar. In the far corner rested shapes wrapped in burlap and twine, no longer fresh, but preserved by the chill. Reed's lips curled, not in shock nor fear, but memory. Each one of them had been a secret, a sin that dared to speak louder than forgiveness allowed. He had warned them, each in his own way. Some sins could not be confessed aloud. As he stood among his trophies, the lantern's flame wavered. Footsteps echoed faintly above, soft, uncertain. The trapdoor creaked. For the first time in years, the preacher's calm faltered. Someone had followed him. He reached for the shovel against the wall, gripping it like a staff. "Who's there?" His voice cut through the still air, firm, commanding. No answer. Only the whisper of wind and the low groan of timber. Then another sound. The trapdoor slammed shut. Darkness swallowed the cellar. The lantern sputtered out, leaving Jonathan Reed alone amid the buried truth. For a long moment, there was silence. Then his voice, low and deliberate. "So, the devil has finally sent a messenger." Above him, the bell on St. Matthew's tolled 11, its echo bleeding through the woods like a lament. Reed stood in the dark, a predator temporarily blind, but unbroken. Whatever game had begun, he vowed it would end on his terms, and the watcher would soon confess, as all sinners must. The next morning arrived gray and heavy. Mist hung low over the valley, blurring the outlines of fences, barns, and rooftops. Black Hollow seemed muted, like the world was holding its breath. Inside the parsonage, Jonathan Reed stood before the mirror, carefully buttoning his black coat. His reflection looked paler than usual, though his smile remained perfectly rehearsed, smooth, calm, and deliberate. Only his eyes betrayed the restless storm beneath. He had not slept since the trapdoor slammed shut. Whoever had been above him that night had vanished by the time he climbed back up. There'd been no footprints outside the hut, only dragged leaves, and the faint mark of something heavy moved through the mud. He'd called quietly into the night, pretending defiance, while inside his heart thudded with something unfamiliar, dread. The watcher wasn't merely taunting him now. They were close, closer than he'd ever expected. When he arrived at St. Matthew's that morning, the townspeople were already gathered near the steps. The Watkins boy had died during the night. Reed felt every set of eyes shift toward him as the news spread like wind-tossed fire. Some came seeking comfort, others for reason or blame. Mrs. Watkins's cries echoed up the hill, her grief raw, uncontained. Reed moved through the crowd slowly, each step measured as though treading on glass. "My sweet child is gone, Reverend," she sobbed as he approached. "You said God would keep him safe. You said our boy was chosen for forgiveness." He took her trembling hands. "He is safe now, Martha," he said softly. "No sickness, no pain. His soul rests in the arms of mercy." But her eyes hardened through the tears. "Then why did he cry your name before he died?" The question cut deeper than any accusation could. He felt the weight of it settle over them, drawing whispers from those gathered nearby. He smiled faintly, forcing composure. "Grief speaks nonsense, dear lady. The body remembers pain in strange ways." Yet her words chased him as he turned toward the chapel. Inside, dim sunlight filtered through stained glass, scattering dull reds and greens across the pews. He knelt at the altar, hands gripping the edge until his knuckles whitened. Somewhere between prayer and panic, he whispered to himself, "Control the fear, and you control the truth." By noon, Deputy Owens came again. He stood just inside the doorway, hat in hand. "Reverend," he murmured, tone cautious, "Henry Watkins wants the doctor from Richmond to examine the boy's body before the burial. Claims something didn't sit right with the way he passed." Reed's jaw tightened before he could stop it. "That's unnecessary. The child was sick for weeks." Still, Owens continued, "People start talking. You've been the last one to see more than a few folks before their troubles began. I figure it's best we cut off rumors early." For a moment, silence stretched long enough to measure a heartbeat. Reed's smile returned, thin and sharp. "Rumors are the weeds in the Lord's garden, Samuel. They grow quickest in places without faith." The deputy nodded, though his gaze didn't waver. "That may be. But weeds have roots, Reverend. Tending them might mean getting your hands dirty." After Owens left, Reed closed the doors to the church and drew the curtains tight. The cool air inside pressed heavily, and his mind kept circling back to the cellar beneath the woods. That trapdoor, that sound. He couldn't risk another night like it, not with tensions rising. He had to act first. Toward dusk, he set out once more along the narrow road past the graveyard. Lanterns swinging at his side, he moved like a ghost among the stones. Past the final row, under the skeletal oaks, stood the caretaker's shed. It waited, silent and still, its roof glistening with dew. He paused before the door, listening for movement. None. Reed entered cautiously, lantern lifted high. The floorboards creaked underfoot. He stared at the trapdoor and found it exactly as he had left it, locked. The earth gave off its familiar damp scent, but something else lingered, faint yet distinct. Smoke. He looked closer and saw the charred edge of a page caught between the boards. Pulling it free, he recognized the handwriting instantly. His own. It was torn from his private journal. The edges were burned, but enough remained to see the words written in his neat, relentless hand. "Temptation is obedience misread. Mercy demands silence." He froze. His journal had never left his desk drawer, locked at all times, which meant someone had been inside the parsonage. By instinct rather than thought, Reed dropped the page and hurried back through the graveyard. The lane glistened under faint moonlight. From a distance, the church bell tower cast a long shadow across the snow-dusted fields, his monument of faith now looming like judgment. When he reached his house, the front door stood ajar. Inside, the oil lamp still burned. The warmth felt wrong, like a trespass. Reed walked through each room, careful, methodical. The silence was absolute until a floorboard creaked behind him. He spun around, but found nothing. Only the open window, curtains fluttering in the cold. His gaze slid toward the desk. The drawer was unlocked, the journal missing. For the first time in years, his calm shattered fully. He tore through the bookshelves, the desk, the floor beneath the rug, searching. Nothing. The intruder had taken it all. His secrets, his chronology, his confessions disguised as theology. He sank into the wooden chair, hands gripping the arms so tightly the finish cracked beneath his nails. Whoever held that journal now held the keys to his undoing. There would be no redemption, no forgiveness once its pages surfaced. Outside, a sound broke the silence, the low clang of the chapel bell. Once, then twice, ringing not by wind but by hand. No one was allowed in the church at this hour. Reed seized the lantern and strode into the cold, boots striking hard against the frozen ground. The bell continued to toll, uneven, almost mocking. The door of St. Matthew's hung open. He stepped inside to find the aisles shrouded in shadow. A single candle flickered on the altar. Beneath it lay his leather-bound journal. He approached slowly, setting down the lantern. Beside the journal stood a note, written in ink still glistening wet. "Do you confess what you have done beneath God's house?" Reed's breath quickened. His hand trembled as he reached for the journal. The moment his fingers touched the cover, the candle flickered violently and went out. Darkness returned, total and suffocating. Then, from the far corner near the confessional, came a whisper. Soft, human. "Do you confess, Jonathan?" His heart pounded. "Who speaks?" he demanded, voice echoing off the wooden beams. The whisper came again, closer now, the words almost tender. "I've read your words, Reverend. All your mercy, all your sin. Do you believe God forgives the shepherd who devours his flock?" Reed turned sharply, lantern trembling in his hand. But there was no one, only the empty pews and the cold breath of night swirling through the open doors. Yet behind him, faintly, the whisper carried a laugh, a low, brittle sound that crawled under his skin. The lantern light caught movement briefly, a glimpse of fabric vanishing behind the altar. Reed gave chase, but the church yielded nothing but stillness. Whoever it was had disappeared again, leaving only the journal and the note, and the echo of that soft, knowing laughter. That night, Jonathan Reed locked himself inside his parsonage. Outside, snow began to fall. Inside, he lit every candle, unable to stand the dark. For the first time, he prayed not for forgiveness, but for silence. But silence, it seemed, had turned against him. Snow blanketed Black Hollow in heavy silence. The burial took place the next morning, just as the sky cleared enough to reveal a brittle winter sun. The Watkins boy lay in a small pine coffin beside the frozen ground. Villagers gathered close, breath fogging as they murmured prayers led by Jonathan Reed. His voice rose soft and solemn, but something in it trembled beneath the rhythm of his words. For the first time, he feared his own tongue. Mrs. Watkins clung to her husband's arm, face hollowed by grief. Behind her, Clara Monroe kept her eyes low, gloved hands clasped at her waist. Even Deputy Owens stood back from the crowd, hat pressed to his chest, watching Reed with silent study. The preacher could feel them all, those gazes like knives through his cassock. When the last bit of earth fell onto the coffin lid, he whispered the final benediction, "And may the Lord receive the pure-hearted unto his rest." Then he turned away, smiling faintly as the crowd dispersed. Only Owens lingered. "You did right by the boy," the deputy said quietly. "But strange thing, doctor from Richmond never got here. Letter saying he was delayed by weather, yet he swears he never got invited. You reckon someone could have intercepted that?" Reed's lips pressed thin. "The post can fail like all men, Samuel. Or someone might want to fail," Owens muttered, eyes narrowing. "I'll be asking more questions." Reed nodded politely, though his pulse beat in his ears. He walked back toward the churchyard gates, boots crunching over snow. Inside his coat pocket, his fingers brushed a scrap of paper he hadn't placed there. He stopped, heart freezing. Slowly he pulled it free, a folded square of parchment, damp at the edges, creased as though carried long. Written in the same sharp hand as before, asterisk, "The boy is not alone under the ground." Asterisk. His breath came shallow. He looked back toward the grave, a dark, fresh scar in the earth. His smile faltered completely now. For a moment, he almost stepped backward, But the murmurs of townsfolk nearby forced composure back onto his face. He slipped the note into his sleeve and walked on, the weight of the words dragging at his every step. That evening, as twilight pooled behind the hills, Reed waited until Black Hollow slept before returning to the cemetery. The cold had thickened. The world was quiet enough that even the crunch of his boots felt like a shout. He carried a small lantern and a spade, both wrapped in cloth. He told himself it was only to be sure, to prove the taunt false. He stopped the grave, its surface stark against the snow. Lantern light painted the mound in trembling gold. Kneeling, he pressed his gloved hands into the earth and began to dig. Minutes passed. The silence grew enormous. The spade hit something solid. Wood. His breath came ragged now, white clouds catching the light. He scraped away more soil until the coffin was fully revealed. For a long moment, he only stared at it, wrestling with terror and pride. Then he pried the lid open. The body of Elijah Watkins lay still as before, small hands folded over his chest. But there on the boy's chest rested something that hadn't been buried with him. A folded piece of paper pinned under the child's palm. Reed snatched it up, hand trembling. It read in precise script, *, you speak of salvation. But what redeems a preacher who buries his own truth? *. Underneath, in faint pencil, *, check the chapel floor. *. He dropped the note, heart hammering, and quickly covered the grave again, hands numb and clumsy. Every sound seemed amplified. The wind sighing through dead branches, the creak of trees bending under frost. He felt watched. As he shoveled the last earth into place, a flash of movement caught the corner of his eye, too quick to identify, edging behind the stone wall that bordered the graveyard. He froze, staring into the dark shapes of the bare oaks. Nothing moved now. When he returned to St. Matthew's, the church loomed as if it had been waiting for him. He set the lantern on the altar and paced the aisle, every instinct pulling him toward the center of the floor. There, between the pews, was a faint crack in the wood. It had always been there, overlooked, the boards warped by years of damp air. But tonight he knelt to touch it, and felt cool air seeping through. He fetched a chisel from the vestry and pried the plank loose. It lifted easily, too easily. Beneath lay a narrow cavity, its edges lined with dirt and broken stone. He lowered the lantern. Inside were two things, a discarded rosary and another note. He unfolded it slowly. The handwriting had shifted, calmer now, almost elegant. *, this is where the first one lay, before you consecrated the soil. The Lord sees what you hide beneath his altar. *. A tremor passed through him. He reached deeper, fingers brushing the cold shape of something wooden. He pulled it up. It was the handle of a tool, old and stained dark. A hammer. His hammer. The one he believed lost years ago after the disappearance of the old caretaker. He stared at it, arms shaking, memory flashing, the man's defiance, his threats of exposure, the accident behind the church grounds. The grave never marked because there had been no ceremony, only silence and dirt. Reed had told himself the man had fled town. Now, he could almost see the watcher's plan unfolding. Someone knew the truth piece by piece, leading him like a dog on a chain. The bell tolled once above him, hollow and sudden. He flinched. The rope swayed though his hands hadn't touched it. Then came a sound below, beneath the floorboards where the cavity gaped open. Faint at first, rhythmic. It was the sound of knuckles tapping wood from inside. Reed stumbled backward, lantern nearly toppling. "Who's there?" he shouted, voice cracking. No answer, only another knock, slow and deliberate. His breath turned shallow, the air thick with frost and fear. He forced himself closer, staring into the hole. "If this is a trick," he hissed, "I will not be made a fool." A final knock cut him off, louder, followed by a whisper rising through the crack. He froze. The voice was small, unmistakable, the same pitch, the same trembling tone he'd heard days ago at the Watkins home. "Reverend," it breathed, "you said I was forgiven." The lantern fell from his grip. Flame licked across the floor before he stamped it out, chest hammering. When he looked again, the cavity was empty, silent. He staggered back to the altar, gasping for air, eyes darting across the room as if expecting the boy's pale form to appear beside the pews. At dawn, townspeople noticed faint smoke rising from the chapel roof and found Reed inside, collapsed near the altar, clothes smeared with ash, the loose floorboards nailed hastily shut. He claimed exhaustion, insisted it was nothing. They believed him, for who would doubt a preacher mourning a child? But as they escorted him home, Clara Monroe noticed something unusual on the pulpit rail, a fragment of paper caught beneath the candle wax. When no one watched, she pulled it free. It read, asterisk, he is beginning to doubt himself. Soon he will confess. Asterisk. And beneath the signature, a single initial scrawled sharply, C. A week passed and Black Hollow seemed caught between grief and suspicion. Snow melted into streaks of gray along the cobblestone paths, and the sky hung low, pressing down on the small town like a weight. St. Matthew's stood silent save for the soft hum of the bell rope swaying in the wind. Jonathan Reed had not preached since the day of the boy's burial. He was seen rarely, pacing inside his house at night with lamps burning until dawn. Rumors spread faster than prayer. They said the preacher had visions, that he'd spoken in his sleep, calling out names half the town recognized. They said he'd been seen wandering near the woods again, lantern flickering through the pines at impossible hours. The people of Black Hollow, once devoted, now whispered his name the way one might whisper illness, quietly, carefully, infected with dread. Clara Monroe was still the only one who spoke kindly of him, at least publicly. When she visited his parsonage, she carried the air of compassion, though her eyes betrayed curiosity. Reed let her in one evening just after sunset. He looked thinner, his collar loose around his neck, his smile too practiced to hide the exhaustion underneath. "Your visits bring light, Clara," he said, ushering her toward the fire. "The town grows darker by the day." "You've given them hope many times, Reverend," she replied, voice calm but deliberate. "But people fear what they don't understand. Perhaps they only need truth from you." He turned toward her, studying the way she folded her hands calmly on her lap. It unsettled him, her composure. "And what is truth to them?" he asked. "What comfort can it bring if it shatters what they believe?" "That depends," she said. Her eyes didn't waver. "On whether the truth belongs to God, or only to you." The silence that followed was long enough for the fire to crackle and fill it. Reed forced a smile and poured 2 glasses of cider. "The Lord's work requires burdens, Miss Monroe. Some are not meant for the congregation to bear." She took the glass, kept her gaze steady. "And some burdens grow heavier when hidden." Their words hung sharp between them. Reed turned away first, moving toward his desk. On it lay his recovered journal, or rather, one that seemed to be his, a perfect replica, though some entries were subtly altered. He had found it that morning on the church steps, placed deliberately, tauntingly. Some pages he recognized, others were fabrications, vile accounts blending truth with invention. Whoever crafted it knew the facts intimately. Each false entry twisted him further inward, poisoning even his memories. He picked up the book, flipping through the pages before showing her one. "Read that," he said. "Tell me if it sounds like the hand of faith." The passage described a confession from years prior, one involving a girl who had vanished after a late sermon. It implied guilt so vivid it almost breathed. Clara's lips parted as she read, but her expression didn't shift. "If this is your handwriting," she said quietly, "then you have much to explain. But if not, you have an enemy who knows your soul better than most men know themselves." Her words struck deep. Reed leaned closer, lowering his voice. "There is no enemy. There is only sin-hunting honesty." He grasped her hand suddenly, his fingers cold and trembling. "Someone is turning faith into mockery. Someone defies God beneath my roof." Clara met his grip steadily. "Then stop searching for devils in others, Reverend. Sometimes they wear our own faces." That night, after she left, Reed sat in darkness with the journal open before him. He flipped through each page, whispering the words like a curse. Every line fed his dread that perhaps he had written them, that his own hand had betrayed him in sleep. But the thought was unbearable. He refused to believe madness had taken hold. Around midnight, another sound broke through the still room, the faint tap of metal against glass. He looked up sharply. Outside, past the frosted window, stood a figure cloaked in gray, face obscured by the reflection of candlelight. The tapping came again, deliberate and slow. Reed's pulse leapt. He rushed to the door, flung it open into the night. Snow swirled faintly, stinging his cheeks. No one stood outside. Only a single object lay at his feet, a church key, large and old, engraved with the cross of St. Matthew's. He hadn't seen it since the caretaker's time. Someone had left it there as invitation or command. He turned the key over in his palm, and something caught the light, tiny scratches along the handle forming the letter C. His chest tightened. Clara. But no, he had to be sure. Driven by a rage born of terror, Reed marched back to the church. Wind howled through the valley, carrying the faraway wail of dogs. He unlocked the doors and stepped inside. The air was frigid. The candle stubs on the altar burned low. His every echo seemed to answer him. He called out softly, "Show yourself." From behind the confessional came a sound, a faint click like something metallic shifting. Reed strode toward it, gripping his lantern high. The door of the confessional hung slightly ajar. Inside, the shadows recoiled, revealing nothing. Only the smell of damp wood and candle wax remained. But on the small bench rested another folded letter. He opened it, light trembling in his hands. Asterisk. The graves were never the secret. Look beneath the river bridge if you seek redemption. Asterisk. The handwriting matched every note before it. Reed's breath caught. The river bridge lay half a mile south, abandoned since the mill collapsed 2 winters ago. Too many had died there. Too many ghosts walked beneath its timbers, at least in rumor. He should have waited until morning. But sleep had become an enemy. So he went. The snow thickened as he approached the bridge. The dark water below moved slow as tar, chunks of ice drifting along its surface. He stopped midway across and raised the lantern. The wood beneath creaked, the old boards coated in frost. At the far end lay what looked like a box, square and half buried in snow. Kneeling, he brushed the snow away. It was a chest, small, wooden, padlocked. And beside it, someone had carved words into the railing with a knife. Asterisk. Do you still smile when you kill? Asterisk. The air left his lungs. He sank back, gripping the lantern so tightly it shattered in his hand. Blood streaked across the snow, crimson in the dim light. He kicked the chest open with the heel of his boot, sending splinters flying. Inside were bones. Small, delicate bones wrapped in a church cloth. A child's remains. He stared down, shaking violently, until his eyes caught something glinting beside the bones, a locket, familiar even through grime. He pried it open. Inside was a miniature drawing of Clara Monroe. He fell back, gasping, confusion splintering into horror. His mind raced. Had it all been her manipulation? Her kindness, her questions, her calm? Or had she uncovered what he'd buried and sought justice in her own quiet way? He didn't know. What he did know was that someone had laid this here for him to find, deliberately, tortuously. The wind picked up again, carrying the faint echo of the bell tower far off in the dark. Each toll felt heavier, closer. Reed pressed his bleeding hand to his chest, trying to breathe. "If this is her doing," he whispered to the wind, "then she will face her judgment before God." But even as the words left his mouth, he felt it, eyes from a tree-line, watching. Somewhere in the dark, a figure turned away from the bridge, leaving footprints in the fresh snow. Reed followed those prints until they vanished near the edge of the woods. There, hanging from a low branch, he found something swaying gently. His own clerical collar, stained dark with dried blood. For the first time, Jonathan Reed did not pray. He laughed instead, low and hollow, the sound of a man unraveling. And across the valley, St. Matthew's bell tolled once more, though no living soul had touched its rope. The next morning dawned bleak and bone-white. Frost curled over every fence and windowsill in Black Hollow, sealing the town in unnatural silence. When the sun rose, it did so reluctantly, casting a weak, gray light through the branches. Jonathan Reed stood at his window, staring out at the frozen fields, his reflection ghosting in the glass. His knuckles were bandaged from the lantern's break, blood soaking faintly through the cloth. He hadn't slept. The images from the bridge replayed endlessly. The bones in the chest, the locket, Clara's face trapped inside it. Each thought bled into another, forming something monstrous. If she had set the trap, she must pay. If not, then whoever had must be watching even now, laughing from some unseen perch. He turned away from the window and looked toward the desk where his journal once lay. In its place, a new object waited, the small wooden cross that had belonged to Elijah Watkins. He hadn't brought it home. He hadn't touched it since the funeral. Yet there it sat, neatly centered on the desk, as if placed there during the night. Reed's breath caught in his throat. He picked it up carefully, turning it over in his hand. On the back, carved with a blade, were the words, Asterisk, the Lord sees through smiling liars. Asterisk. His knees weakened. For the first time, he dropped the pretense of calm. The mask cracked entirely. He knelt on the rug, clutching the small cross, muttering the same prayer again and again, pleading not for forgiveness, but for revelation. Asterisk, show me who they are, Lord. Show me who hunts me. Asterisk. But heaven offered no reply, only the whisper of wind through warped shutters. By midday, Deputy Owens arrived again, knocking with the heavy hand of authority. Reed composed himself enough to open the door. Owens smelled faintly of tobacco and snow. His eyes carried the fatigue of a man who had seen too much and understood too little. Reverend, he said, stepping inside, there's trouble down by the river bridge. Some kids poking around come back shouting about Bones. Tell me it ain't got anything to do with you. Reed blinked slowly. Why would it? Owens studied him, gaze narrowing. Because when I got there, I found your church cloth wrapped around the remains. Think maybe someone's playing games, but the town's riled up. Half of 'em think you've gone mad. Reed forced a faint laugh. Mad? No, Samuel. Just tired of sin dressing itself as righteousness. That's so. The deputy's tone hardened. Then you won't mind answering a few questions tonight at the tavern. Folks want hearing from your own mouth that you ain't lost your way. Calm them down before they do something foolish. Reed nodded slowly. Of course. The shepherd must soothe his flock. Owens sighed. Good. And Reverend, if you know something about those bones, best say it before someone else decides your silence is guilt. After he left, Reed stood alone in the dim hallway, feeling the world around him tightening like a noose. The watcher had turned the town against him with precision. Every move felt designed, every whisper positioned. But the tavern meeting could serve him, he thought. Perhaps his enemies would reveal themselves in the crowd. That evening, he walked into the tavern under the weight of 100 watching eyes. Men lowered their cups as he entered. Women turned faces toward the hearth. Reed removed his coat slowly, moving like a man unafraid. Brothers and sisters, he began, I hear rumor has replaced reason. Allow me to remind you who I am. His voice carried authority, still smooth despite the strain. I have buried your dead, blessed your children, tended your wounded. Would madness do that? Would a devil spend his nights praying for your safety? A murmur rippled through the room. Some nodded. Others exchanged wary glances. Then Clara Monroe rose from a bench near the fire. Her expression was calm, but her eyes burned with something quiet and resolute. Reverend, she said, her voice clear, you speak of salvation, but truth still sleeps beneath your house. Tell them about the grave under the chapel. The room fell silent. Reed's head turned sharply. For a heartbeat, he said nothing. The only sound was the fire's crackle and the wind outside. There is no grave, he said finally, voice clipped. Only lies whispered by those too cowardly to confess their envy. Clara stepped closer. Then why did you dig there 3 nights past? Deputy Owens saw the lantern glow from the hillside. What did you bury, Jonathan? Her use of his first name drew gasps from the crowd. His composure fractured. Careful, he warned, the silk peeling from his tone. You speak on matters beyond your understanding. No, she said steadily. I understand enough. That every soul who vanished after seeking your counsel carried some burden you could not absolve. The tension split the air like lightning. Owen stepped between them, trying to keep control, but the moment had gone too far. The town wanted spectacle. They wanted guilt, visible, bleeding, repentant. Reed's shoulders straightened. "You think me a monster," he said, almost whispering. "You crave confession? Then hear it. Yes, I have known sin. I have known the weight of others' sins until they drowned me. I took their secrets into my hands, into my prayers, and when they still refused to let go, I cleansed this town myself." The crowd recoiled as if he had struck them. Clara's face blanched. Owen's hand went to his holster. Reed's smile returned then, not kind, not human, but fractured and wild. "They were liars, thieves, adulterers. You thanked me when they vanished, though you never said it aloud. You wanted the rot gone. Don't feign innocence now." Owens barked, "Step away, Reverend." But Reed only spread his arms wide. "Do you not see? I saved you all. My hands built your peace." He turned toward Clara, eyes trembling with fury and some darker sorrow. "You," he hissed, "you wanted truth. So tell them whose handwriting cursed my door. Tell them who played God beside me." Clara's lips parted, but no sound came. Instead, she looked down at her gloves, her right hand trembling. Then, slowly, she held up a key, the same key that had appeared on Reed's doorstep. "I gave you that key, Reverend," she said softly, "so you'd see what you've done." Her tears came quietly. "I found the records. The caretaker, the merchant's son, the widowed seamstress, they all came to you before they died. You didn't cleanse them, you silenced them." The tavern erupted in noise, shouts, gasps, the scrape of chairs. Owens moved forward, but Reed stepped back toward the door, laughing, a dry, broken sound. "Faith is never pure," he said. "Someone must bear its stain." Then he turned and fled into the snow. He ran until the tavern lights faded behind him. The cold burned in his lungs, snow crunching beneath his boots. He stumbled toward St. Matthew's, his sanctuary, his stage. The bell tower loomed above, dark against the stars. Inside the church, his breath echoed. He slammed the doors shut, bolted them fast. He knelt at the altar, clutching the bloodied bandage at his hand. "They were mine to save," he muttered. "You chose me, Lord. You sent them to me." No voice answered, only the groan of the wind through the rafters. Then a sound, a low creak from above. The stairs to the bell tower shifted under weight. He lifted his head slowly. "Who's there?" he called. No reply. He rose, candle in hand, climbing the narrow steps. Halfway up, the smell of smoke hit him. When he reached the top, he froze. The floor was scattered with torn pages from his journal, set aflame, the fire crawling toward the rope. And beside it, in the wavering light, stood Clara Monroe. Her face was streaked with tears. In her hand, she held the last of his letters, the one he had unknowingly written to himself. "It was never about God," she said quietly. "It was about you." She dropped the letter into the fire. Reed lunged, but the flames caught the rope. The bell swung loose, crashing through the floor, the toll echoing through the valley. Below, the villagers looked up from their houses, hearing the final ringing of St. Matthew's, slow, mournful, and endless. When the bell fell silent, smoke curled from the church roof, carrying years of secrets with it. And in that silence, Black Hollow knew, the preacher who smiled while killing had finally met his own sermon's end. Dawn came late to Black Hollow that winter morning. Smoke still curled faintly from what remained of St. Matthew's Church, drifting above the valley like a dark benediction. The great bell had fallen through the floor and lay cracked among the ashes, its bronze surface blackened, but silent at last. The snow around it had turned gray, slushed with soot and memory. Jonathan Reed's body was never found. The ruins drew the whole town before midday. Farmers, widows, children, the devout and the doubtful alike, stood in silence before the charred shell that had once been their sanctuary. Some wept quietly, others only crossed themselves in fear or guilt. They looked for answers among the ashes, but all they found were fragments, the warped handle of a shovel, shards of glass from the altar lantern, and a single unburned page from Reed's journal caught in the debris. Deputy Owens retrieved it carefully and read aloud to the few who lingered closest. The words were written in Reed's familiar hand. Asterisk faith without confession breeds rot. When silence becomes the greater sin, fire is God's mercy. Asterisk. Those who heard bowed their heads and said nothing more. The wind swept through the ruins, as if to erase the remaining evidence. That afternoon, Clara Monroe stood alone on the hill overlooking the wreckage. Her black coat fluttered in the cold gusts, and a strand of ash streaked her cheek. In one gloved hand she held a folded letter, the last one Reed had written before the fire. He had left it under her door, sealed in wax marked with the church's cross. Its words were brief, almost tender. Asterisk, you will never understand why I did what I did. But know this, I envied your peace. You believed in truth. I only believed in control. If the bell rings again, it shall be your voice the town follows, not mine. Asterisk. She folded the letter back, pressed it against her chest, and looked toward the graveyard where the snow lay thick over forgotten names. The villagers whispered of leaving the ruins untouched, a warning and a wound. Even now, they could not decide whether Reed had been a savior gone astray or a monster sanctified by deception. Owens joined her near dusk, his long coat dusted in snow. Some folk think he jumped from the bell tower, he said quietly. Others think you helped him burn the place. Clara's eyes stayed fixed on the valley. And what do you think, Samuel? He sighed. I think men like him don't die clean. They leave pieces behind, faith, fear, guilt. Town might carry his shadow longer than any grave could. She nodded faintly, then turned and began walking down the hill. The snow crunched beneath her boots, each step slow, deliberate. Behind her, Owens called, You staying in Black Hollow? For now, she said without looking back. Someone has to keep the truth from sinking under all the prayers. Days blurred into weeks. The ruins of St. Matthew's remained as they were, untouched and watchful. The townsfolk resumed their lives, though certain habits lingered. No one rang bells after sundown, no one crossed the cemetery alone, and no one spoke Jonathan Reed's name above a whisper. One night, as the moon hung low and orange over the valley, Clara sat in her small cottage by candlelight, sorting through the papers she'd gathered since the fire. Letters, journals, ledger pages, all written by Reed across the years, all pulled from his house before the blaze. Each told a story different from the one he preached. They revealed his growing obsession with confession, his belief that sins could only be absolved through total silence, no forgiveness unless the sinner could no longer speak at all. He'd written of voices that haunted him, of temptations disguised as guidance. Somewhere along his path from preacher to executioner, he had convinced himself that killing was mercy. Clara read until the wax burned low. Then she came to a final entry, dated the evening before the fire. Asterisk, if she knows the truth, she will reveal me. But perhaps that is the Lord's will. Perhaps redemption can only come when the mask is torn away. I hear him calling. Or maybe it's only the boy again. Asterisk. Her fingers trembled as she closed the page. Outside, wind howled across the valley, rapping against the shutters like patient hands. She rose, crossed to the window, and watched the faint outlines of the burned tower on the hill. Somewhere beyond it, the bell rope still swayed in the cold, untethered, whispering against the charred beam that held it. People claimed later they sometimes heard the bell ring in the dead of night, not loudly, but softly, as if someone unseen pulled it once before vanishing. The sound was enough to wake the dogs, and enough to keep the children whispering prayers until morning. By spring, the town rebuilt its lives around absence. Fields thawed, the river bridge was replaced, and markets reopened. Only one place remained untouched, the ruin on the hill. Grass began to creep through the blackened stones, and wildflowers rooted among the ashes. Yet no one stepped across its threshold. Owens walked there one evening, weeks after the thaw, carrying the small wooden cross they'd found on Reed's desk. He placed it near the cracked bell and knelt. You always said God saw everything, he murmured. Reckon he saw this too. Maybe that's punishment enough. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye, on a narrow shape tucked within the bell's hollow. He reached in and drew it out, a sealed envelope, dry despite the months of rain. The handwriting on it froze his breath. It was Reed's. He broke the seal carefully. Inside was a single line written in charcoal. Asterisk, it wasn't the whispers that guided me, Samuel. It was the silence. Asterisk. Owen stood there a long time, the page trembling in his hand. That summer, the town held its first Sunday service since the disaster. The congregation gathered in the open air above the valley, with Clara reading psalms in a voice both steady and somber. They spoke not of damnation, but of endurance, the way people rebuild after truth unearths what was buried too long. When the final prayer ended, she looked up toward the hill and thought she saw a flicker of light within the church's ruins, like lantern flame pressed against blackened glass. She didn't tell anyone. That night, while the town celebrated its fragile peace, Clara returned to her cottage, alone under the pale moon. On her table sat Reed's letters and journals, stacked neatly, tied with cord. She stared at them for a long time, then opened the stove door, fed them one by one into the fire. As they burned, the room filled with the faint smell of incense and ash, and for a brief, disquieting moment, she thought she heard a laugh, thin and distant, rising with the smoke. She closed her eyes, steadying her breath. "Be still," she whispered to herself. "The past cannot rise again." But outside on the hill, a breeze stirred the crack bell rope. It moved once, just once, then stopped, leaving the town wrapped in deep, listening silence. And in that silence, Black Hollow lived on, never truly free of the preacher who smiled while killing. Summer in Black Hollow carried a strange stillness that year. The fields shimmered green beneath an exhausted sky, and the river ran slow, thick with silt and memory. The villagers went about their routines, mending fences, tending markets, rebuilding barns. Yet a quiet unease lingered, a wound that refused to close. Though months had passed since the fire, people still looked up at the hill each evening, toward the charred skeleton of St. Matthew's Church. The bell, cracked and blackened, lay half buried in the grass, but its presence dominated the skyline like a tombstone. The air carried the faint scent of ash even now, when it rained. Life returned, but faith had not. Jonathan Reed had become legend. The children whispered stories about his ghost roaming the graveyard, still reciting sermons to the dead. Mothers told them to hush, claiming stories gave sin power. Yet when night fell and the wind moved just right, everyone heard it, the faint echo of the bell tolling once before dawn. Clara Monroe tried to drown it out with work. She spent her days teaching, her evenings walking along the fields, notebook in hand, recording fragments of the past before they slipped away. Owens had asked her to write a public account of the preacher, to quiet rumors, to fix the story as history rather than haunting. But she hesitated. Truth, she'd learned, was as dangerous as silence. One afternoon, she visited the ruins again. Grass had begun to overtake the stones. Insects buzzed lazily through the heat. Where the altar once stood, purple wildflowers bloomed, their petals soft against the charred beams. She sat upon a fallen column and opened her notebook. Words came haltingly, as if the act itself disturbed the air around her. He believed he was chosen, she wrote. Asterisk, but perhaps he was only consumed by the need to control what he feared most in himself. Asterisk. A shadow crossed the grass nearby. She looked up sharply. It was Owens, his broad frame casting long lines across the ruins. "I figured I'd find you here," he said, tipping his hat. "Still looking for ghosts?" She smiled faintly. "I'm just writing what they leave behind." He stepped closer, his gaze sweeping the place with weary affection. "Been thinking," he murmured. "Reed didn't work alone long as folks believe. Someone helped bury all those truths. Someone kept him safe." She closed her notebook slowly. "You think he wasn't the only one? I think a man like that thrives because people want him to." He knelt, brushing dirt off a fragment of glass from an old window pane. "We called him Savior even when the signs were right under our noses. I know guilt when I see it, Clara. I see it in every pew that still ain't filled." She studied him quietly. "And what about you, Samuel? You searched those woods. You saw the things buried there. Do you carry guilt too?" He hesitated. "Maybe I do." His eyes met hers. "Maybe Black Hollow's full of it." They stood in silence until the wind shifted and the bell rope scraped faintly against metal, a soft, hollow sound that neither dared call real. Clara tracked it with her eyes, unnerved by how the rope moved though the air was dead still.
Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.